So if you've seen any of the podcasts that I've done with Ruben from the Ruby Tuesday this month, you know we've been covering all kinds of horrors. But as we've been doing that, I've been compiling my own watch list of movies that I think are worthy of viewing. So let's dive into my list of a handful of horrors you should watch right now. One thing to note is that these aren't in any particular order, and all of them are available to watch as part of a streaming platform in the US, at least as of this recording. I'll let you know what platform I watched each on as I get to them. So first up is Veronica from 2017, and it's available on Netflix. This Spanish supernatural possession horror is inspired by or based on true events, and it gave me chills. In Madrid in 1991, a teen girl finds herself besieged by an evil supernatural force after she plays with Ouija with two classmates. This movie opens with a very distressing emergency call and communications over the police radio. We're thrust into a very confusing scenario where there are children crying and a woman screaming, and the police are going up into an apartment building, and when they arrive at the apartment where the emergency is taking place, they have a very distraught look. And then the story takes us back a couple of days to witness how everything unfolds. Now first, because this is based on a true story, it adds another level of terror to something that's already extremely creepy. And this has great imagery. Most of the time we see a looming shadowy figure that slowly pursues members of the family. And some of the brilliance of this story is using children as the main targets of the entity. And this greatly helps to increase anxiety because they're innocent, vulnerable, and helpless. There's a large sense of isolation that also takes place here, making the main character of Veronica that much more susceptible to the horrors. Now, there aren't necessarily any jump scares in this, but there are several times where things appear that can make you jump. I love how the film uses the natural elements to its advantage. Household items create ominous shadows, and light reflections build out optical illusions. And then all of those are then combined with movement to just unsettle us. Now, this isn't a cherry tale by any means, but I like how the facts and real photos are laid out for us at the very end. It's a great way to cap what we've experienced, and it created one last massive chill that ran down my spine. I highly recommend checking out Veronica if you haven't already. I mean, it's an hour and 45 minutes, and I was sucked into the narrative the entire time. So this next one is from 2000, and it's called Uzumaki or Spiral. It's available on Amazon Prime and is very atmospheric and unsettling. Mass hysteria grows within a town as the townspeople become obsessed with spiral shapes. Now, this is based on Junji Ito's manga, and the production does have a slight comic feel to some of the execution. Now, the camera work is sometimes strange, but it can also be creative in how they inject spirals into some of the cinematography. And there are some really good practical effects and then some not great special effects. You need to know going in that this is a very slow burn with awkward dialogue, which funny enough actually helps to enhance the weirdness, making it enjoyable. The story follows a high school student and her boyfriend as they witness relatives, friends, and other townspeople descend into obsessive madness. The mystery that is involved does eventually become engaging, but it does take a while to get to it. Now, don't go into this thinking it's scary or disturbing on the levels of other Japanese horrors like Ju-on or Ringu, but Uzumaki does contain its own helping of weirdness that makes this quite the experience. And even though it's 90 minutes long, portions do make the story feel longer than that. So if you can make it through the slowness and the oddities, the last third of the movie is enjoyably freakish, with the deaths that occur becoming just increasingly bizarre. And fun fact, there's a wanted poster of Junji Ito featured towards the beginning of the movie. Now, this is good for a one-time watch, and it's certainly different, but I'm not sure it's worth revisiting multiple times. Next up is the 2007 horror comedy Trick or Treat, which is available on HBO Max right now. This is a collection of 4 stories, all contained in one larger story that takes place in one night in a small town that just loves to celebrate Halloween. We see a suburban couple who learns the dangers of blowing out a jack-o'-lantern before midnight. 4 women cross paths with a costume stalker at a local festival. A group of pranksters goes too far and discovers the horrifying truth buried in a local legend. And then finally, a cantankerous old hermit is visited by a strange trick-or-treater with a few bones to pick. Throughout this movie, we see a kid of sorts walking around the neighborhoods, wearing footy pajamas and a burlap sack with button eyes over his head. Ha 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 ha. I mean, creepy and disturbing doesn't even begin to describe it. That character is just nightmare fuel. And I love how the entire movie subverts expectations. It takes what we believe to be a straightforward story and then turns it on its head. Then, in wonderful and effective twist, it mixes dark comedy with unsettling horror. And this is way more violent than I expected it to be, and many times I winced in sympathetic pain. And I love how each of these individual stories also ties into each other, making what could feel like an anthology actually one large story with several facets to it. Now for me, I think my favorite story arc involves Brian Cox as that crotchety old man who seems to hate Halloween. I mean, the tale is morbidly dark, and it takes place all inside his home, which is just as nasty and decrepit as he is. The comedy within this movie also worked very effectively. And while I didn't find it laugh out loud hilarious, the darkness made me chuckle, and there were more than a few nervous laughs as well. Some of the dialogue is very cringy and cheesy, but I think that's more out of design to really play up some of the campiness of the story. Now, this is a quick watch at only 82 minutes, and it goes by even faster thanks to the vignette style of storytelling. Even though this has been on my list for quite a while, I watched this for the first time the other night, and I had a blast with it. I think this is going to make its way into a regular Halloween watching rotation because it's creepy, gory, and knows just how seriously to take itself. So this next one is from director Renny Harlin, who's brought us movies like Die Hard 2 and Cliffhanger, but who's also directed gems like Cutthroat Island and The Adventures of Ford Fairlane. 2013's Devil's Pass is a found footage story that's a mix of sci-fi and horror, where a group of students goes to the location of the infamous Dyatlov Pass incident to make a documentary, but things take a turn for the worse as the secret of what happened there is revealed. Now, found footage horrors were very prevalent for a while, and we still get them every now and again, and when they're done well, they can be freaky and unnerving. But when executed poorly, it's like watching the security camera footage of the yarn store at the mall. Luckily, this leans way more towards the former. The story follows 5 students bent on making a documentary about the Dyatlov incident, where 10 hikers mysteriously died. The remoteness and large amount of snow work as a character within the story, creating obstacles and tensions among the students. And much of that tension comes from the journey, knowing that something terrible will be on the horizon, but we never know exactly what it will be or when it will come. Within this, there is an inevitable breakdown of trust between the team members, which only works to increase anxiety. But the real crux of the horror comes in the last act of the film, where this goes from environmentally created fear to sci-fi driven terror. The visuals are dark and obscured, and night vision is employed to give the scenes this alien green glow. The pace then becomes frenetic and chaotic, with an intense chase sequence that is just made terrifying by horrific noises from unseen beings. We do get to see some glimpses eventually, which are then pretty unnerving. The ending of this is a mind trip too, but I'm not sure how ultimately satisfying it actually is. Devil's Pass is another one of those that is great for a one-time viewing because it creates an air of dread and is a pretty fun ride for its 100-minute runtime. But it's not one that I think you'll crave to watch over and over again. So somehow this next one has escaped my viewing until now. It's 2014's The Taking of Deborah Logan, and it's available on Amazon Prime. Now, this story is about an elderly woman battling Alzheimer's disease who agrees to let a film crew document her condition. But what they discover is something far more sinister that's going on. So this is another found footage horror that becomes just oh so wrong. Here we have another documentary film being made, much like that in Devil's Pass, but this time it's a medical student creating the documentary to learn more about Alzheimer's. Jill Larson plays Deborah Logan, and she crafts a very sympathetic and horrifying character. At times, a lot of the tension and terror come just from Deborah stopping what she's doing mid-stride and then staring off into space. That detached look is upsetting and effective. Much like most found footage stories, it's what happens in the background that causes our skin to crawl. And here we get to see the cameras capture just some freaky imagery and some very odd behaviors from Deborah, but then once the lore kicks in and more of that mystery is uncovered, it just becomes downright messed up. Some of the footage comes from security cameras, and that is made all the more unsettling because there's no audio to it. We just watch actions play out and our minds then fill in the sounds. There's a supernatural-ish element combined with a serial killer motif, which is then all rolled into a psychological horror. Now, parts of the story also involve children, and just like in Veronica, when innocents are in the crosshairs, the anxiety automatically ratchets up. And there's one scene in particular that is iconic and comically disgusting that involves a young child. It is just wrong on every level. In addition to Jill Larson, the rest of the cast is wonderful too, especially Anne Ramsey as Deborah's daughter. She convincingly plays a woman who's having to be caretaker to her ailing mom, dealing with the frustrations that arise from that, but then also trying to live her life as well. She balances compassion and exasperation perfectly. The Taking of Deborah Logan is 90 minutes of stress-inducing entertainment, and it is something that just shouldn't be missed. Next up is Host from 2020, and it's a Shudder original. Now, that's a super quick watch at just under an hour long, so it's not going to take very much of your evening or daytime if you're easily spooked. It was filmed during the pandemic and is a seance gone wrong supernatural possession horror. I loved how we are voyeurs into this Zoom call. We see things in the background that maybe those on the call don't, and I was genuinely surprised at how freaky this movie got. More often than not, the cameras didn't move around with people, so we see a fixed shot and then action moving in and out of the frame within a person's application window. And this accentuated the creep factor at all the right times. Now, there are other times where a call was on a mobile, so we get to pan around a room or travel with the person as they move about their surroundings. And this too added a very unsettling atmosphere to the story. The lore that was introduced and then built up in such a short amount of time was exciting, and it made the hairs on my arms stand up. The special effects are done well, and I think that any imperfections are hidden because this is taking place over a virtual meeting, so the quality is expected to go in and out. I became so invested in the story and what was going on that there were more than a few times that I jumped just because of the visuals, and I loved it. Now, I don't think this is one that you rewatch over and over, but I've seen it twice, and both times I really enjoyed being freaked out. I mean, if you're looking for a quick scare and you have Shudder, Host is a fun one. So this is another horror that I've had on my list for quite some time, but I just got around to watching. It's The Wailing from 2016, and it's available on Amazon Prime. This South Korean story is another just messed up and disturbing supernatural possession horror, where a village begins to experience all sorts of weird phenomena, mostly ending in brutal deaths. I love how there's a ton of mistrust built up in the narrative due to the arrival of a stranger. At points, mob mentality comes into play, creating all sorts of chaotic unrest. And there are several twists to this, and it's one that you really have to pay attention to in order to grab hold of the entire meaning. As the movie goes along, the intensity continues to ramp up, and at one point, the movie uses some very effective sound design to agitate us. There's a seance with a young girl and a shaman performing a ceremony, and as this is happening, there are beating drums that just increase in volume as the shaman chants louder and louder. And then all the while, the young girl begins to just scream her lungs out. It's unnerving and agitating, and it's also wildly effective. This whole movie is quite a visceral experience. It's bloody and violent at times with visuals that are continually upsetting. The violence is also spread throughout, getting more and more violent as the minutes progress. I love that there's a family drama at the core of this that only increases the dread. Now, I found the characters to sometimes be annoying and foolish, but that was often because they were reacting to family stresses. I really enjoyed the struggle of good versus evil that permeates this story. We as the audience are confronted with several characters and asked to decide if we believe that they are good or evil, and I love that the choices aren't always as clear-cut as they appear. Now, something to make note of is that this is a long film. It's 2 hours and 36 minutes, which is about an hour longer than most of our traditional horrors. What this does well with its time, though, is envelop us in the lore. But there are portions that I think could be trimmed because we see a lot of yelling and screaming through a lot of situations, especially from our main protagonist. When these sequences happened, they weren't progressing the narrative forward and really just could have been trimmed. But even with these left in, the film is still wildly enjoyable and engaging. I think the second half of the story picks up the pace and then ramps up the intensity and chaos, but we need the in-depth world building at the beginning to create a compelling story. If you haven't seen this, I highly recommend checking out The Wailing. So this next one has been recommended to me several times, and I finally had the opportunity to check it out. It's 2014's A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, and it's available on Shudder and is billed as an Iranian vampire western. Now, I love that the movie is presented in black and white. I mean, it creates a noir aspect, and it also allows shadows to obscure features, which creates dread. This is a slow burn of a film where the characters meander through the scenes and through their lives. There's the girl, who is the vampire, and she's menacing when she needs to be, but otherwise she just feels like a drifter within her own town. There's a sort of romance that takes place as well as a family drama, but the weight of the film for me hinges around the searching and longing for connection. Each of our characters is on a separate journey to belong, or at least feel like they belong. The dialogue is sparse, and the shots are patient and atmospheric. And the pace is slow and even meandering at times. Now, it's an hour and 41 minutes, and I did feel the time more than once as that story went along. I wanted more from the story, and I think there's more that the narrative can unpack with the girl. I believe there is a wonderful character arc to be examined because she could be very rich with detail. But as it is, she's mostly a stranger to us, but is someone worthy of exploration. And really, for the story to be more compelling, it needs to flesh out the players more. We can get a sort of understanding of who they are in the present, but on the whole, they're fairly unknown to us. Despite this, though, I still enjoyed the experience, and I think this is one to at least watch once, especially if you like art house films. Now, this being a vampire film, there are surprisingly few kills. Now, I'm not saying there aren't any, but I kind of expected more. And some of them, though, are very satisfying because the victim wasn't necessarily a great person. Now, one thing that stood out to me was the soundtrack. And while I don't think I was familiar with any of the songs, they were catchy, almost hypnotic at times, and they enhanced the mood, giving it a sort of late 50s to early 60s flair. And this is also helped by some of the costume designs, where we have a character who wears dark jeans and a white t-shirt with rolled up sleeves, and then another wears this dress and headscarf that would feel right at home in that time period. Now, there's even a 1957 Ford Thunderbird that is featured, adding one more layer to that feeling. But this also contrasts with some modern imagery of tracksuits, tattoos, and flat-screen TVs. All in all, the mixture works well to give it an almost timeless look. So if you're in the mood for a different sort of vampire movie, I definitely recommend checking out A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night. Okay, so before I get to the last movie, here are a few honorable mentions. So The Cleaning Lady, which is on Amazon Prime. It's a quirky and disturbing look at obsession. There are a lot of issues with this movie, but it does capture unhinged craziness really well. Next is The Strangers, which the first one. I haven't seen the sequel, and it's available on Netflix. It is all sorts of messed up, where you have three unknown people come in and terrorize a couple one night. It's violent and terrifying, and it's supposedly based on true events. And finally, there's Mayhem, which is available on Shudder and stars Stephen Ewan and Samara Weaving. And this one reminded me a bit of Belko Experiment mixed with 28 Days Later. It's got tons of bloody action, and it was a fun ride. So last but certainly not least is 2016's Hush from director Mike Flanagan. It's on Netflix and it stars Kate Siegel as a deaf and mute writer named Maddie who retreated into the woods to live a solitary life. And one fateful night she must fight for her life in silence when a masked killer appears at her window. Now, this is tense almost from the very start. There's not a lot of time that passes before the film just dives right into the terror. I just watched this for the first time, and I love how a good portion of the story of the film has to do with midnight mass. It's like Flanagan was willing his project into existence by having this story talk about it. The isolation really works to cause anxiety, and then that is enhanced exponentially because our protagonist is deaf. The silence is terrifying as the assailant can move around unnoticed as long as they're not seen. And that just makes my skin crawl and really is the stuff of nightmares because it sits so squarely in reality. There's nothing paranormal or otherworldly in this, just pure thrills and chills caused by plausible circumstances and extreme vulnerability. The single setting of this is incredibly claustrophobic and it's almost suffocating. The isolation also helps to build out the atmosphere, removing a lot of the possibilities that help could be on the way. And Kate Siegel is wonderful in the role. She's smart and rational, and she's up against an antagonist who is cunning and patient. And the mix of these creates palpable anxiety that I found thrilling to watch. Much like in A Quiet Place, I found myself holding my breath as Maddie would attempt an escape or some other feat. I found myself willing her to be silent in her footsteps so that the perp couldn't figure out where she was. I'm surprised that this is only an hour and 22 minutes long because it didn't feel that short, but it also never felt long or dragging. We're set up in Maddie's world, and then within a very short period of time, the crap hits the fan and the terror begins. I do think there are some plot conveniences present, but they didn't overshadow the anxiety of the narrative. If you enjoy chase movies, this one has a lot of back and forth that is aggravatingly stressful. And it's worth checking out any time of the year, but it is perfect for Halloween time if you're looking for a thriller. Now, there are still several more that I think could be on this list, but I need to watch or rewatch them again just before adding them. And I'm sure that they're going to make an appearance on some future recommendation list. I hope this list has been helpful to you in finding something to watch when you're in the mood for a horror movie. I know not all of these are going to be something that you're going to want to watch more than once, but hopefully you do have fun with them. So what horrors are on your list? I'd love to hear about them so I can add them to my growing list to watch. If you enjoyed this, please give it a like. Also, don't forget to share and subscribe. I'm Chris. This is Movies and Munchies. Thanks for couching with me.